Very happy to introduce to you this afternoon's speaker, Dr. Husam al-Mallak. I'm particularly happy because he is lecturing at SOAS, a course called Modern Trends in Islam, and I know that his students enjoy it a lot. And so I've always been, tempted to attend one of his classes but never could, so I'm very glad that we have the chance to listen to him here. He wrote his PhD on Ibn Arabi and Nietzsche, the subject that he's going to talk to us about here at SOAS, and he has a number of articles about to be published. He's given a number of public lectures, including in Oxford. And as I said, we are fortunate to have him on the teaching staff at SOAS at present. So here is Dr. al-Mallak for you. Welcome.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Thank you, Professor Sperl. Thank you to SOAS. Thank you to the Ibn Arabi Society and to Richard for organizing and hosting this. Thank you for this introduction. And thank you to you, the audience, for allowing me this privilege to be able to speak to you about my research topic, which I had finished here. I will be giving you a very brief overview about this topic. I'll try to keep this as short as possible, and inshallah, hopefully we can develop this or unpack this through dialogue, through discussion, try to leave as much time as possible for discussion. My research was about Friedrich Nietzsche, the German 19th century, 20th century philosopher, and what I was trying to argue, and it was only an argument, it is only an argument, is that this particular philosopher has something very relevant to say about religion, and I think arguably, by extension, very relevant to say about Islam, particularly Islamic modernization, and a very important crisis that he argued throughout his writings will be unmanifesting itself, uncovering itself throughout this experience of modernity. And my argument is that this crisis, which he refers to as nihilism, is equally important to the modern Islamic context. So he has something very important to say about this crisis, which will be experienced by Muslims undergoing modernization. But equally important, I argue, is that Nietzsche has also something to say about how to overcome this crisis of nihilism. And arguably, it is here which we return back to Ibn al-Arabi's thought. Ibn al-Arabi, arguably, provides a system of thought, a religious system of thought, a philosophy, which can allow this overcoming of nihilism. It represents a return to God after the death of God, which is the definition of this term, anatheism, the return to God after the death of God. But what I focus upon is how exactly does God die within the Islamic context? And again, it is particularly within the intellectual modern Islamic context, where now this crisis is in the process of unveiling itself. As he argued, it had unveiled itself in the modern European context. So he has something very important to say about this crisis of nihilism and how to overcome this nihilism, which he actually was not able to clearly or to be able to articulate. How do you overcome nihilism? Maybe Ibn al-Arabi has something very crucial to say about how nihilism can be overcome. To appreciate this crisis, one needs to look back towards this experience, this concept of modernity. What exactly is modernity? An experience that all humans are undergoing, are modernizing. And hence it is particularly relevant nowadays to Muslims as well. For that, need to look back to previous philosophers of modernity, particularly Kant. People usually ask, how do you define modernity? What are the milestones or thresholds of modernity? The religious Reformation, the religious beginnings of modernity with the Reformation, the cultural beginnings with the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution. But intellectually speaking, people look back to Kant, and he defines the Enlightenment as that intellectual threshold of modernity. A contemporary German philosopher, Habermas, he says that the project of modernity is inaugurated by and initiated by Immanuel Kant. The threshold of modernity is shaped by Kantian philosophy. Kant, more specifically, installed reason as the supreme set of judgment before which anything that made a claim to validity had to be justified. Setting up reason as the highest authority. And it was that which Nietzsche was very critical of. And it is that which he argued will give rise to this crisis of nihilism, this very modern crisis, which was covered up throughout the history of humanity, but now, in modernity, it is unfolding, it's being unveiled, this crisis. This threshold of modernity, this philosophical threshold of modernity, setting up reason as the supreme judge, is one that is also reflected in the modernization of Islamic thought, and I'll come back to this shortly. But more specifically, it is within ethics that you see this supreme reason assuming that supreme authority, more authoritative than any other previous authority, and there mainly religion was the previous authority. Here, with Kantian philosophy, what you might be able to describe as a paradigm shift, an ethical paradigm shift, a meta-ethical paradigm shift. What is it that now determines this concept of morality? Is it reason, or is it religion, by extension, revelation? And here you have quite categorically, with Kantian philosophy, upholding reason as the source of morality. It would be easy to show how common human reason, says Kant, knows very well how to distinguish in every case that comes up what is good and what is evil. On its own behalf, morality in no way needs religion, whether objectively as regarding willing or subjectively as regards capability, but is rather self-sufficient by virtue of pure practical reason. It's quite explicit. Now reason determines morality. You don't need religion anymore, which was the crux of the criticism of Nietzsche had against this threshold, the criticism he had against modernity, which now arguably makes others refer to him as the earliest postmodern thinker, that thinker who will go back and be critical against the foundations of modernity. And he says that it is nihilism, this crisis is so fundamental. It is an existential crisis, but more so, it is an ethical crisis. It's a crisis by which, having established reason as the source of morality, now reason turns against its own foundation and undermines its own foundation. And here he argues that this happens in the sphere of morality. And for Nietzsche, a very crucial aspect of his argument is that morality in itself, as a concept, as a category, has always been a religious concept. Religion always determined morality. Morality is a religious concept. You can't have morality without religion. But what happens now is that if we have to go back to give you very specific examples, now morality, based upon reason, turns against religion, undermines its own foundation, which was very characteristic of what was happening in modernity in European societies at that time, was that societies were becoming more and more secular. Again, that becomes very problematic how one defines it, but religion was no longer the highest authority. And now he defines this concept of nihilism as being that self-devaluation of the highest values. Now the highest values, these interpretations by which humans award meaning to their lives, here the highest values being truth, but also particularly moral values, values like the good, turn against themselves, turn against their foundation. And he says when that happens, morality, these values can no longer be justified. This is nihilism, according to Nietzsche. We can no longer justify what truth is, what these values, like good and evil. Reason has turned against it, their religious foundation. And later, philosopher Heidegger, he will say that one of the most famous formulations of this crisis of nihilism is that famous statement in the parable of the madman, when Nietzsche says that a madman walks into the market shouting, declaring that God is dead. But equally important, it is how and why did God die? It's not a statement of atheism. He's not saying that God does not exist. But how does God die? He is actually murdered by those common human beings, us moderns. We have murdered God. How? It is through upholding these highest values of morality. In modernity, even though people were no longer religions, they were still, nevertheless, very moral. It now becomes the highest values. It becomes the highest meaning. People are still very, very moral. And he says, well, now that no longer exists. And Heidegger says that this represents, the statement that God is dead represents a formulation of what exactly nihilism means. And it's a very ambiguous, term, concept, process, nihilism. And Nietzsche was very, very non-systematic in how he describes this crisis. Nevertheless, he was even more ambiguous about how to overcome this crisis of modernity, this crisis of nihilism. Later scholars said that actually it was impossible for Nietzsche to be able to articulate how one can overcome nihilism. Nevertheless, he did allude towards key features, key criteria, characteristics of this project of the overcoming of nihilism. Criteria predominantly defined by this concept that the union of opposite values, which we heard earlier on was a key feature of those mystical philosophies. And again, quite famously, he argues that it is the overman who overcomes nihilism, who is now able to unite these values, these opposing values, which values like good and evil. And he has a statement. He gives an example of this overman. He is the Roman Caesar with the heart of Christ, uniting opposite values. Another very key feature of this project of the overcoming of nihilism is that it is affirmative, this worldly affirmation of everything, including that which is most objectionable, morally objectionable. Affirmation to the highest degree, to the degree that one not only affirms everything, including that which might be considered to be morally objectionable, but to love it. This concept of love. And he has these doctrines by which he attempts to articulate, describe this affirmation, this thought experiment of the eternal recurrence of the same, and more specifically, this love of fate, that one loves one's fate regardless of how detestable, how much suffering, how evil, everything is affirmed to the extent of love. Key features of this project of the overcoming of nihilism. Now, I argue that this is occurring, this is being reflected in the Islamic context, particularly with the modernization of Islam, specifically within the intellectual developments of Islam. This paradigm shift, this ethical paradigm shift, also characterizes the beginnings of Islamic modernity. This dialectic between reason and revelation, which is that is the foundation of morality. As we saw here, it was resolved in the sphere of philosophy, according to in the European context, but ethics and morality, the place of reason, that was debated amongst the theologians, the mutakallimun. And you had different theories. What is it that determines this concept of morality? Is it revelation or is it reason? And you have obviously the Mu'tazila, who argued that adl, as the highest value, moral value, is determined by reason. Whilst you had the traditionists and later on the Ash'arites arguing that no, it is revelation, religion, through revelation that determines adl, justice. And for reasons, the Ash'arites won the argument in medieval times. Arguably, to what extent were the Mu'tazila defeated? Various reasons, but it is with the modernization of Islamic thought where you have a re-adoption of Mu'tazili theology, beginning with Abdu, later on people like Fadl al-Rahman, where these people attempt to reconcile Sharia and religion generally with modernity. But there is an underlying foundation, a theological foundation for this process of reformation of Islam, but particularly Sharia. And this theological foundation now is quite Mu'tazili. There is no substantial engagement with this theological foundation, this Mu'tazili theological foundation, which represents this paradigm shift, this what can be referred to as a shift from heteronymous morality to autonomous morality. Morality that is determined through reason. And you have much of contemporary intellectual Islamic thought, progressives, liberal Muslims, who try to reconcile the Sharia, Islamic law, with modernity, but assuming a very Mu'tazili concept of justice, a concept that is determined through the use of reason. And there's a lot of tensions with this attempt to reconcile this modern understanding of religion, of the Sharia, with modernity, trying to reform it, upholding this concept of justice. And you have very specific scholars now saying that to have a more comprehensive reconciliation between Islam, particularly Sharia, with modernity, you need to revisit those theological foundations of what exactly is it that determines Islamic morality. You can't, it's no longer just useful to try to reconcile specific aspects of Islamic law, Sharia, with modernity, trying to reform them. No. For a more comprehensive reconciliation, you have to revisit that theological foundations, which is a project that is very rare. It is only arguably in the context of modern Iran, with these neo-rationalists, the school of neo-Mu'tazilism, where you do have a re-examination of that theological foundation of Islamic modernization. And it is within this theological, neo-theological re-examination where you can identify this process of nihilism, whereby religion loses its value. And specifically, one of the most important neo-theologians is Abdul Karim Soroush. Some of you would have heard or come across his scholarship. There you have a more focused re-examination of this theological, this Mu'tazili foundation, which is quite categorically characterized by this objective concept of morality based upon human reason. Morality does not need religion, is not determined by religion. Reason is what determines religion. And, for very specific, I won't go into the details, he now presents a reformulation of that essence of religion, that essence of Islam. And crucially, that essence is very experiential in nature. By extension, what he considers to be essential, what he considers to be non-essential, what he considers to be accidental to religion, is Islamic law. There's no longer any need to try to reconcile Islamic law with modernity. Islamic law is not essential to religion. It is that experience of revelation, subtitle of the conference. He explains, he tries to rationally articulate the process of revelation, this concept of khalq al-Quran, which he says that the Mu'tazila in the medieval times didn't have the intellectual capabilities to try to elaborate this process of revelation, which he refers to back as and explains as synonymous with inspiration, ilham. But crucially, he argues that experience, and here he has a very mystical, very Sufi definition of experience that is essential to religion. However, what most of the mystics, Islamic mystics themselves, emphasized as instrumental to realizing this religious experience was Islamic law. You couldn't experience the divine without Islamic law, according to majority of the mystics. But now he argues Islamic law is not an essential part of this experience. By extension, it means that you can't experience religion. Religion is devalued. And like I said, if I have time, I'll come back to try to give other examples of how now, based upon human reason, religion is undermined. And again, if you remember with Nietzsche, is that you can't have morality without religion. You can't have morality without religion. And it is a crisis. A crisis, I argue, which is being experienced in contemporary modern Islamic thought. How to overcome this crisis? Well, arguably, does Ibn al-Arabi's mystical philosophy present, does it, satisfy these criteria which were alluded to by Nietzsche? Obviously, two very important, we heard earlier on, two very important criteria, this concept of the union of opposite values. Very, very important, not just for Ibn al-Arabi's mystical philosophy, but mysticism in general, this concept of the coincidence of opposites. And very importantly is to see how this mystical philosophy of Ibn al-Arabi now goes beyond this moral worldview. How does Ibn al-Arabi's philosophy present a transmoral or amoral worldview? How does Ibn al-Arabi now, according to his philosophy of wujud, reformulate this concept of morality by looking back at these ontological values of being, non-being, wujud and adam. It's an ontotheological reformulation of morality. Evil is the opposite of good, and nothing emerges from God but good. Evil is only the non-existence of good. Al-shar wa adam al-khayr. Hence, all good is being, wujud, while evil is non-existence. And again, here, this concept, this ontological reformulation has very important similarities with somebody who later on will develop Nietzsche's thoughts, Heidegger. But to what extent one can compare the two, that's debatable. The union of opposite values. And again, as we heard earlier on, you see very clearly with Ibn al-Arabi's philosophy the union of opposite metaphysical values or theological concepts like the concept of tanzih and tashbih, and the union, the upholding of both values. And again, Ibn al-Arabi's philosophy, to a large extent, elaborates how these values can be unified. Simultaneous affirmation and denial of these values. And the example, he continually refers to the Quranic example. There is nothing, ليس كمثله شيء وهو السميع البصير. Here you have, within the Quranic verse, a union of transcendence and immanence. And how are these unified? Not just by upholding those two, but in, forgot which Risale, he explains how it is through transcendence. To uphold transcendence, God has to become immanent. to uphold tanzih, God has to become immanent. And he has a very specific reading of the first part of this Quranic verse, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. He has an alternate reading, I think it's Risalat al-Jalal wal-Jamal, where he says an alternate reading that focuses on that transcendent part of this verse. The reading says, لَيْسَ كَمَثَلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There is nothing like his examples. Method. This transcendence is understood with reference to immanence. To be transcendent, God has to become immanent. And he presents an example of that. Affirmation. I'm sure you have all come across how important love is for Ibn al-Arabi, most famous of the verse, of poetry. It is crucial. It is characteristic of his philosophy, this philosophy of love. But what is instrumental? How does one experience love? And it was asked earlier on, how does one attain this irfan, this ma'rifah? Through love, as the root of irfan. But there is another starting point for love. And according to the mystics, the Sufis, and particularly Ibn Arabi, is that love is now realized, can be realized through the law, through adherence to the Sharia. Again, going back to that famous hadith that God loves human beings through the nawafil. And if he comes close to me, I will love him. It is through upholding the nawafil that there can be love. And nawafil are the supererogatory acts of worship. What's crucial here for Ibn al-Arabi is that all human acts represent acts of worship. All human acts are now governed by the law, by the Sharia. And it was asked earlier on, what is the Sharia? You can't have that love without the Sharia. Well, you can have, but the love of God is now realized through the letter of the Sharia. The Sharia is the haqiqah, and the haqiqah is the Sharia. Again, commonly juxtaposed as opposite, well, not opposite, but different values. Sharia is the mahajja al-bayda, the white pathway. And he states, whoever that leaves the mahajja, the Sharia, halak, is doomed. Sharia, quite specifically, he argues, is defined by the ahkam, those rulings that are revealed through the Quran, but also the authentic hadith. And he has a very specific way of authenticating hadith through kashf. It is through upholding the letter of the Sharia, the letter of the law, that now, he says, will necessitate tujib al-mahabba, through upholding the letter of the law. Those laws, these ahkam, and he says that the vast category of the ahkam is al-ibaha, permissibility. But he nevertheless emphasizes upholding the letter of those ahkam that have been revealed. And there is no forbidding that which has been decreed being legitimate under the Sharia, or forbidding that which has been legal. There's no tahrim or tahleel. That has been determined by the ahkam, the revealed ahkam. Sharia, according to him, and here he's very, very Ash'arite, is the decree of God, not that of human reason. The decree of God, which is now revealed through the Quran and through the Sunnah. Sharia is what determines justice. These ahkam is what determines the concept of justice for Ibn al-Arabi. It's not reason that determines justice or the Sharia. And again, here he emphasizes you can't have haqiqah without upholding the letter of the Sharia. You can't have it. You can only realize these tahqiq through upholding the letter of the Sharia. So there is a very strict methodology by upholding the letter of the Sharia in order for one to realize, to become a muhaqqiq. It becomes instrumental for Ibn al-Arabi. That's an argument. That's my argument. Is Nietzsche relevant for Islam? Well, you have to go back and think. Is Islam, in fact, undergoing the same experience that Christianity underwent in Europe in the process of modernizing? Is Islam undergoing the same kind of challenges, the same traumas that led to the secularization of society in Europe? Is that applicable to Islam? Arguably, yes, it is. And you have a lot of views to the contrary. But same kind of challenges upheld, experienced by Christianity. The challenges of science, of morality, based upon the authority of autonomous reason. Reason is now being faced by many Muslims. And arguably, this now facilitates, this unveils this crisis of nihilism for Muslims. Heidegger says, Nietzsche represents the conclusion of that history of philosophy, beginning with Socrates and Plato, but it ends with Nietzsche. Metaphysics ends with Nietzsche. It is there where you have this history of thinking in binaries. Either one binary is privileged or affirmed over another. This now comes to its conclusion with Nietzsche, where you see this philosophy of contradictions, of opposites in the philosophy of Nietzsche. How do you come up with a new way of living without these values of truth, of good, of the beauty? How? And again, arguably, even Heidegger, those who would develop their thought by reflecting upon Nietzsche later on, he begins to start adopting very mystical language towards the end of his philosophy. But arguably, it is within, if the argument is correct, if nihilism is going to be experienced, if the death of God is going to be experienced in its Islamic context, then arguably, after the death of God, there is a return. It becomes necessary to look back to Ibn al-Arabi, not out of interest, not out of love. It represents an intellectual necessity to go back and look at the philosophy of Ibn al-Arabi. He, I argue, represents this concept of anatheism, the return to God after the death of God. But intellectually, it is crucially only after the death of God that one can return back to religion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We have a little bit of time for questions. I must say I found this really a fascinating presentation because so many of the themes that we heard about this morning have resurfaced here in your paper in the modern context, so there's really quite a lot to talk about and think about. Let me kick off with just one question. When it comes to Islamic modernism, there's one phenomenon you didn't mention, and that is the very widespread Wahhabi-inspired Salafism that one finds in different parts of the Islamic world, and it's become really quite a noticeable movement. Do you see this also as a form of anatheism or perhaps as another form of nihilism, which how would you judge this phenomenon?
I wouldn't say it's anatheistic. It's not a return to God because they have not experienced the death of God. They have yet to experience the death of God. But arguably, even within Wahhabism or Salafism, you do see that those challenges faced by the modern context, scientific challenges, but also moral challenges as well. It is certainly not an anatheistic experience. It is, they have yet to fully experience modernity, be it in science or in morality specifically. But I'm just going to be very argumentative here. There are, looking back towards Ibn al-Arabi, there are crucial similarities between Ibn al-Arabi and Salafism and Wahhabism, this upholding of this very literal understanding of the letter of the law. This adherence to the letter of the law can be problematically very similar to the two experiences, but crucially, with the Wahhabis, with the Salafi context, no, it's not anatheistic because they haven't yet experienced the death of God. They haven't, in fact, upheld reason as the highest authority yet. It's still revelation.
Okay. There's a lot one can answer to that, or more questions one could ask, but I would like to open this to the floor. Who would like to kick off? Yes, please, over there.
I'm just wondering where the idea of spiritual death fits into this thesis you're putting forward.
Spiritual death. I don't know if there is a spiritual death, but there is a de-emphasis of the spiritual in favor of the rational. It is the rational that is now emphasized, that characterizes modernity. To what extent does that represent a death of the spiritual, if the spiritual means that experiential? I don't know if there is a death, but I mean, no, I don't think there is yet a spiritual death, but nevertheless, it is a question of authority. Which is it that has the highest authority? In the modern context, everybody lives a moral life, or tries to live a moral life. And it is not spirituality that determines morality. Does that mean the death of spirituality? Arguably not.
Right. What would you say to the viewpoint European political systems at the moment are just a subtle variation of existing clergy-based political systems? I mean, even though it has evolved, but it is still authoritarian, but it's capitalistic in its nature. It's corporations who are actually running the show. What would you say to that, as opposed to clergy? Does that make sense?
Well, for Ibn Arabi specifically, I mean, the clergy are not the ones who have the highest authority, but if you're looking at it from a modern political context, that's not my field, the clergy, and if you look at the example of Iran, this is what the whole political ideology is based upon, this enforcement of the Sharia. The Sharia here is now determined through revelation, not through reason. So in that sense, it is still very not modern, albeit being implemented in a very modern context, using very modern tools. Criticisms of modern European systems, they can criticize all they want, but that doesn't go to the heart of this crisis of nihilism. It is these modern systems, European, Western, or modern systems that uphold the authority of morality, that is now what is at the heart of this crisis of nihilism. Political criticisms, that's politics, and it's dirty.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. In relation to what the gentleman said regarding spiritual death, can we conceive of this notion, the modern secular notion of rationality, as a human rationality? This is what is emphasized, the human rationality. And the whole problem of modernity becomes, well, can we come to a truly universal and unconditioned point of view if rationality is merely human and is merely, therefore, contingent and historicized and so forth? So this becomes a problem of modern rationality. But, and so it's an egocentric point of view. It's what's plausible, and this is kind of what we were talking about earlier in the day, it's what's plausible from the egocentric point of view. And so the idea of spiritual death is being that there needs to be a death of the ego. There needs to be found out before there can be awareness of the transcendent, in a sense, and then we can return to what Ibn Arabi was talking about Plato, that Plato being a philosopher, but in fact he actually understood that the origin of intelligibility, the origin of the intellect is truly within the good, the one, the essence, and so modernity perhaps could be conceived as this. Okay, we have this human rationality which we take to be primary, but now we have this problem of relativism, and the contingency of the human point of view, and the need to return to a transcendent basis to intelligence, as the absolute, in a sense. Yeah, and perhaps we can relate here the notion of the Sharia as the manifestation of that, will, and so we can perhaps transcend that duality there as well.
Thank you.
Very interesting. This trying to think about, reflect upon your comment. I mean, this concept of transcending the ego, I mean, the concept of the ego itself, this becomes development of a lot of modern philosophers, later modern philosophers, and it's quite interesting just to think of another example where this transcendence of the ego, which was fundamental to the overcoming of nihilism, not just from an Islamic perspective or European perspective, but particularly from this Japanese experience of modernity, how many of these Japanese philosophers, Kyoto school, upheld this not concept of nihilism as a foundation to realize this overcoming of the ego in Zen Buddhism. Nevertheless, modernity is a very universal phenomenon, and again, this concept of rationality that underpins morality as a universal phenomena. Not many will argue against the effects of this universalizing aspect of modernity when it comes to issues like human rights, for example, justified on a very moral, very objective, very rational understanding of what is justice, what the concept of morality, and that becomes universal. Becomes universal. But again, for somebody like Nietzsche, he would have argued that this concept of justice, which now becomes universal, underpins crucial aspects of modernity. He says that can no longer be justified.
Okay, we have time for one or two more.
Hello. Assalamu alaikum. My question has to do, and forgive me if I speak in circles here because I haven't quite yet formulated it, with a kind of secularism that's developing, which I'm noticing particularly since the Arab Spring, perhaps a little bit before, where all sorts of calamity are befalling Muslims in the Islamic age. There seems to be a move towards a kind of hyper-postmodern view of God wherein the Enlightenment project has been put on steroids. So God essentially has to be viewed under the microscope for him to be reified. As Terry Eagleton put it in one of his Gifford lectures, the Yeti view of God is God flitting in the woods somewhere, basically. It's the kind of God that people are looking for. And that's quite a different proposition of God than, say, the Wajibul Wujud that we had this morning. And so that's sort of one half of what I'm trying to say. The other half is the Sharia today is viewed through the lens of postmodern thinking. So it's homophobic, it's misogynistic, it's anti-human rights, and so on and so forth, or it can be called that. And for someone like Ibn Arabi, who profoundly believes in God, has had an experience of God, and believes in the letter of law as a means to acquiring the love of God, how would you say we could begin a project wherein we redefine or we claim back the concept of what God is, and we try and get people to discover the heart of the Sharia, as Ibn Arabi in some of his writings did quite profoundly? He sort of looked beneath the surface, and today all we see is the superficial aspects of it. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very like this steroids analogy. Yes, specifically after Arabic, you saw the prominence of this need for social justice, equality, but particularly this concept of social justice. But again, going back to a theological understanding, what exactly is it that defines this justice, which became so prominent for society, demanding social justice through democracy, rule of law? What exactly do you mean by justice? How do you define justice? And that's a very theological question. Justice, according to the traditionalists, Ash'arites, was defined by the letter of the law. But quite often, you see people having a very common people, people out in the market, adopting a very rational understanding of justice. In that sense, it is a very modern, it's not a postmodern understanding of justice. Even though they claim that they want the Sharia to be instilled, what exactly do they mean by Sharia? Sharia is here quite commonly, quite more than often, is understood in terms of ethics. And it was mentioned earlier on how the Sharia, 99% of the Sharia represents ethics, and only 1% that represents the law. Well, how exactly are you defining ethics here, 99%? What is ethics? And again, that was a very theological question. And again, here you see a quite evident shift, a paradigm shift between that revelation-based understanding of justice, of ethics, to a rational understanding of morality. There is this distinction between the legal and the ethical, but traditionally, particularly from a theological perspective, it was the law that determined the moral.